Greetings, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain.
Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to talk about surveillance capitalism. The last time we talked about advertising, and I promised you that the techniques that were used in advertising were Stone Age compared to what you can do on the internet. And that's what we're going to look at today. So, let's get started. And here we go. All right. You've heard this 100 times, I'm sure. Big Brother is watching you. But I'm going to change it just a little bit. It's not Big Brother that's watching you. It's the big other that is watching you. Well, we'll see what we mean by that. But let's start here. Let's talk about the power of cognitive technologies, because in fact, the technologies we use to communicate and to understand the world often result in big changes in civilization and how we understand each other and how we relate to each other. And so let's start here with writing. Okay, that's one we're all familiar with, I hope. Well, it actually begins with drawing. Drawing actually makes liturgy possible. The liturgy, public celebrations of the cult, of the religion. The priest or the shaman manipulates man-made symbols. Now, it may surprise you to learn that Socrates was against writing. Why would he be against writing? Well, he thought it would destroy the arts of memory. And he thought memory was far more important than being able to read. However, the first writings were not from poets nor from philosophers, but from accountants. Does that surprise you? We know this because we have the Assyrians, of course, all the people in the Middle East around the Fertile Crescent. They didn't use paper, they used clay tablets, and they wrote on the clay tablets and then baked them. And so they last for thousands of years. And we have tens of thousands of these clay tablets. Very little of them are works of literature. They're mostly bills of lading, accounts, and, believe it or not, credit cards. And here's an example. So there's a clay tablet. No, it's not the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a receipt for the sale of some oxen. Okay, you've been told to save your receipts. Well, this receipt has been saved for 3,000 years, just in case Hammurabi wants to audit your taxes. But bureaucracy is impossible without writing. And empire is impossible without bureaucracy. So writing makes the transmission of poetry and philosophy easier, but mostly it makes empire possible. Okay, let's move on. And by the way, I'm just hitting the high points here. And in fact, throughout this presentation, we're mostly going to be hitting the high points. So we'll jump forward a few thousand years to printing. Now, the really key inventions were not printing, because that had been known about for a long time. The key inventions were cheap paper and movable type. This made the printing of books practical. So here's an early Gutenberg printing press. And it was actually based on the wine press, but that's what it is. It's one big press. You press out the paper. Now, with printing, literacy became important. Literacy wasn't important up till this point. because nobody could afford books. If books were hand copied, it was obviously a luxury item reserved to the upper class. But now literacy became democratic, as it were. And the Protestant Reformation would have been impossible without printing. Now, I'm not saying a Reformation wouldn't have taken place. It probably certainly would have. But not the Protestant Reformation. Why? Because Luther insisted on the primacy of the Bible, and he insisted that every plowman could interpret the Bible. But for every plowman to interpret the Bible, he had to have a Bible. So without that printing, this whole movement would not have taken place. And all of a sudden, translation becomes an issue, because not only does he have to have a Bible, he has to have a Bible in a language he can read. And so you saw a tendency for national churches to replace the universal, the Catholic Church. So you got the Lutherans, which was primarily a German church. You got the Anglicans, an English church. The Presbyterians, which was originally Scottish, etc., etc. All right. Now we're going to jump forward another 600 or 700 years to the telephone network. Now, it was built on the telegraph network, but there's an important difference. The telephone made national monopolies possible, and in fact, the first really big national monopoly was AT&T. The telegraph was office to office. You had to go to the office, somebody had to translate your words into dots and dashes, somebody at the other end had to listen to the dots and dashes and translate them into words, and it had to deliver the message. But the telephone was house to house. Here was true personal communications. But it was also something else. It established a networking infrastructure and gave companies the experience in managing complex networks. And, well, these networks, as you can see, were quite complex. You had to have a copper wire pair go to each and every phone. All right. Radio and television. Radio sort of nationalized culture and language. That is, instead of having local dialects, they all tended to merge into one national language. The radio presented this disembodied spoken word. You couldn't see gestures, you couldn't see faces, you couldn't see whether they were smiling or scowling, etc. And it changed politics by empowering demagogues. So Hitler, Mussolini, Roosevelt, and radio preachers. If you ever watch a film of Hitler, he looks pretty ridiculous. But if you just listen to him, it sounds very, very vigorous, very powerful. The same is true for Mussolini. Roosevelt used the radio in an opposite direction. His weekly fireside chats he used to calm a very anxious and worried nation. And then, of course, the radio preachers were able to concentrate on the power of the spoken word. You can see the kind of changes that this was capable of introducing. Television actually softened the effects of radio, because now you had not just the voice, but you had the whole person, or at least you had a vision of the whole person. All right, then comes the computer. Now, these were developed by the US and British government for code breaking. Oddly enough, the computer was actually developed in the 1930s. There were working models of them, and IBM was offered the patent on the first practical computer, and it turned it down because it couldn't see any reason why anybody would want one of these things. Their marketing survey showed that they could, at best, sell 3 of them. Well, basically it's a big adding machine. And here's one of the early ones, the IBM 36065. This would be about early to mid 1970s, and I have a special place for it in my heart for it because this was the first computer that I worked on. Point out some of the elements here, and you can see just how crude these things were. See this big device here? Well, that's the central processing unit. That's that part of the computer that's that little chip now, the central part, that's that little chip in your telephone or on your laptop. Okay. These are memory units, and if memory serves me, these are each 100K, each of these cabinets, these big cabinets. And if I told you how they made core memory in those days, you would say I was just making it up. Here's tape drives. Most of the data was stored not on disks but on tape drives. Okay. These are the disk drives. And it's a little hard to see here, but here are the disk drives. They're a series of platters. They look like records, a stack of records on one spindle. And here you can see it here out of its little cases. Now, that stack of spindles here, each one of these holds 80 megabytes. That was considered big stuff in those days. And they put in a big drive. These are the drives right here. This here is the card reader because you loaded programs into the computer through punched cards. These are printers, so probably 6 or 1200 line per minute dot matrix printers. By the way, this teletype machine, it didn't have screens. This is how you communicated with the computer, was through this teletype. You had to type instructions in it. Okay, well, enough of that. Now, it's a big adding machine, but it could do something interesting. It could process a database. That is, it could act on records, one after another, thousands of times a second. So it could make thousands of correlations in minutes, correlations that would be hard to see if you just read the database by hand. This leads to the illusion of intelligence. So people talk about artificial intelligence. Of course, that's nonsense. They're not intelligent, but they are very useful. Okay, and then we come to the internet. Basically, it's a combination of computers and the telephone network, but without centralization. You see, with the telephone network, every phone had to be wired to a central office. So there was always a sort of hierarchy. But the internet is organized peer-to-peer. Okay? There is no really central controller in the internet. So everything's on an equal basis. Now, originally on the internet, it was like the computer, you just typed commands into it. All right. But things like the browser and hyperlinks replaced the old teletype commands, which were now typed on a screen. With the browser and the hyperlinks, the entire complexion of the internet changed, and then anybody could use it. They didn't have to have a complex command language. And then the search engine makes everything available. Okay, we were at that time very hopeful and optimistic. We really thought, peer-to-peer would mean the end of hierarchies. Nobody would have a whole lot of power because you could just tunnel around them. And really, it would be the spread of truth because the access to information meant that nobody could really lie. If somebody lied, you say, oh, here's the real information. And education would be universalized. Okay, you wouldn't need universities anymore. All right, we had no idea of what was about to happen. Well, but there were warnings. Okay? There were literary warnings. Now, it's very interesting. Things often appear in literature before they appear in life. Um, Good authors have a habit of being able to see just a little bit into the future and give us some warnings of what's really happening that maybe most of us can't see. So I'll just mention a few of these influences, a few of these literary warnings, and we can start with Brave New World by Aldous Huxley in 1931. This little book here. Okay? Now, in this dystopia, humans are engineered in hatcheries. So sex no longer has the meaning of, is no longer connected with procreation. And the populations, all the people are controlled through the use of drugs, through soma, and by psychological manipulation. G.K. Chesterton called it a rebellion against utopias. But what was called Fordism and Freud are the targets. The Fordism was this idea that everything could be rationally engineered, like the assembly line on a factory. All right, another literary warning, 1984, George Orwell. And this is probably the one that most people are familiar with. Here's an early edition from the early 1950s. And you notice there the price is 35 cents. All right. Orwell gives us a whole new vocabulary of tyranny. Big brother, newspeak, doublethink, thought crime, thought police. Okay? These all come from 1984. But his real target was the corruption of language in the service of tyranny. So the slogans of this dystopia are freedom is slavery, war is peace, ignorance is strength. You see how meaning now is disconnected. It's assigned to things. But the real powerful influence in this society is the ministry of truth. The ministry decides what's true and what's not. So both novels are a protest against engineered utopias. The desert of the real. And here's a more recent warning. And I just threw this in at the last minute for reasons which will become clear. Okay, this comes from The Matrix, of course, 1999, where reality is replaced by a hyper-reality.
This will feel a little weird.
This is the console. It's our loading program. We can load anything from clothing to equipment, weapons, training simulations, anything we need.
Right now, we're inside a computer program.
Is it really so hard to believe? Your clothes are different, the plugs in your arms and head are gone. Your hair has changed. Your appearance now is what we call residual self-image. It is the mental projection of your digital self.
This isn't real.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. This is the world that you know. The world as it was at the end of the 20th century. It exists now only as part of a neural interactive simulation that we call the Matrix. You've been living in a dream world, Neo. This is the world as it exists today. Welcome to the desert of the real.
Okay. Now, I added this in because Facebook has just changed its name, and Zuckerberg, talking about the new metaverse that the company has reformed itself as, tells us that we will not be on the internet, we will be in it. And Nadella, the chairman of Microsoft, says the metaverse allows Microsoft to embed the real world into computing. I'm sorry, but doesn't this sound an awful lot like the Matrix? Doesn't this sound like that's what they are preparing us for? And of course, the question comes up about this hyper-reality is who controls it? Well, these literary warnings were joined with works on the technologies of behavior. And we can look at this book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity by B.F. Skinner, 1971. Now, look at this book. B.F. Skinner was big. He had a whole series of books, and they sold well. They sold from the 60s into the 80s. So this is one of the more famous ones, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. We'll examine what he means here. But look at what it says. A stunning new plan to alter human behavior. Now, for Skinner, who was a psychologist, freedom simply meant ignorance. We say an act is free because we don't know enough of what the inputs into that action were. However, with enough data, we could predict all actions. So we could develop this technology of behavior which would allow us to control all behavior. Now, since all actions are controlled, there's no real free will. And since there is no free will, there is no responsibility. You're not really responsible for what you do. And since there is no responsibility, there is no dignity. So you see what he means now by beyond freedom and dignity? Culture can be engineered through behavior modification. We just need more data. Now in 1971, that would be a pipe dream. But soon, that would be very, very possible. All right. But probably the most influential book was Cybernetics by Norbert Wiener, 1948. Look at the subtitle and it will tell you all you need to know. Control and Communications in the Animal and the Machine. Okay, and here's the original 1948 edition, but this would go through edition after edition. It would still be selling well into the 70s and even into the 80s, and even today. All right, for Norbert Wiener, the animal is just another machine. Therefore, so is man and nature. Everything's just this giant machine. And everything could be engineered through feedback loops. Now, feedback loops are a very, very important concept in engineering. Wiener made it everything. Now, based on Wiener, you had the rise of balance of nature theories, and it's probably something you've heard 100 times. That's all that sort of Lion King type stuff. It's total nonsense, of course. Nature is never in balance. Nature has hurricanes and volcanoes and floods and droughts and things like that. So there's never a balance of nature. Nature is always in a state of disequilibrium. That's why you get evolution, in fact. It's always adapting itself. Wiener took a small truth, that is, feedback loops, and made it the only truth. And you'll find that every great error is like that. That is, every great error is not so much an untruth, but a small truth that's displaced all the other truths. Okay. All of this leads to machines of loving grace, because everything is now in place for the coming utopia. You had the technological infrastructure. You had Skinner's behavioral technology. You had Wiener's cybernetic union of man, nature, and machine. Now, the early Silicon Valley pioneers all imagined themselves as Nietzschean heroes from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. But the poet Richard Brautigan expressed the vision. Listen to this. This is very, very interesting. Trigger warning, there's full nudity here, so if you're very sensitive, avert your eyes.
I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think, right now please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think, it has to be, of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace.
Isn't that marvelous? Really? I mean, it's fantastic. Who could object to that? We'll live in a world of communing with nature while skinny dipping. And the machines will all take care of us. How could your heart not ache for that? It would just be a world of making love and you know, taking breaks for the occasional joint. Okay, but one thing was missing. A way to make it pay. All right. Big Other is watching you. You don't need to type anything. Now, they are not hiding what they are doing. Look at this.
One of the things that eventually happens in that preceding line of reasoning is we don't need you to type at all, because we know where you are, with your permission. We know where you've been, with your permission. We can more or less guess what you're thinking about.
Okay. That was Eric Schmidt, who at the time was the chairman of Google. And here's Eric Schmidt again on his justification for knowing what you are thinking about.
People are treating Google like their most trusted friend. Should they be?
Well, I think judgment matters.
Eric Schmidt is Google's CEO.
If you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. But if you really need that kind of privacy, the reality is that search engines, including Google, do retain this information for some time. And it's important, for example, that we are all subject in the United States to the Patriot Act. It is possible that that information could be made available to the authorities.
Well, my question here, has there ever been a police state that didn't use this justification? Well, if you're doing something, that you don't want us to know about, should you be doing it? And he also he fails to mention that they're not saving the data because of the Patriot Act. They're saving the data because they sell the data. So, the social dilemma. This is a very interesting film that I think
when you go to Google and type in climate change
it's available
you're
for
going
free.
to see different results depending on where you live and the particular things that Google knows about your interests.
That's not by accident, that's a design technique. What I want people to know is that everything they're doing online is being watched, is being tracked. Every single action you take is carefully monitored and recorded.
A lot of people think Google's just a search box and Facebook's just a place to see what my friends are doing. What they don't realize is there's entire teams of engineers whose job is to use your psychology against you.
I was the co-inventor of the Facebook like button.
I was the president of Pinterest.
Google, Twitter, Instagram.
There were meaningful changes happening around the world because of these platforms. I think we were naive about the flip side of that coin.
We get rewarded by hearts, likes, thumbs up, and we conflate that with value and we conflate it with truth.
A whole generation is more anxious, more depressed.
I always felt like fundamentally it was a force for good. I don't know if I feel that way anymore.
Facebook discovered that they were able to affect real-world behavior and emotions without ever triggering the user's awareness. They are completely clueless.
Fake news spreads 6 times faster than true news. We're being bombarded with rumors.
If everyone's entitled to their own facts, there's really no need for people to come together. In fact, there's really no need for people to interact.
We have less control over who we are and what we really believe.
If you want to control the population of your country, there has never been a tool as effective as Facebook.
We built these things and we have a responsibility to change it.
The intention could be, how do we make the world better? If technology creates mass chaos, loneliness, more polarization, more election hacking, more inability to focus on the real issues, we're toast.
This is checkmate on humanity.
Well, if you get a chance to see this film, I would recommend it. I don't agree with everything in it, but I think it raises really some crucial questions. It's on Netflix, but it's also available for free on YouTube if you search for it. Why are they doing this? Well, remember we talked about the biological imperative. Capitalism starts by producing products. But it very quickly discovers that it can only advance by producing consumers. We must be liberated to consume. Now, the technology serves as psychological manipulation. It gives us tools we never ever had before that allow us to create a hyper-reality. And this hyper-reality very quickly becomes hyper-conformity. And we no longer live in ethnic communities with shared values. These communities provided some protection. We don't have those protections anymore. And what is happening is called the data exhaust. Every time you touch a key on the internet, the process is called rendition. It transforms your experience into data. So every click, every like, every purchase, every payment, every page view is tracked. Or as someone put it, you don't search Google. Google searches you. For each user to have his own Google, Google must have each individual. This creates a behavioral futures market. So, by correlating an awful lot of data, they can pretty much predict what products you will most likely be attracted to. Think about this. Alphabet, Google, and Meta, as it's now called, Facebook, are the 4th and 7th largest corporations in the world. But you don't buy anything from them. So how could they be so large? Okay, well, there are only 2 business models. You buy the product, or you are the product. By monitoring your behavior, they can predict it. And when they predict it, they can sell it to people who are interested in your behavior, advertisers or politicians. And there's a complex science of choice architecture. Because the best way to predict behavior is to shape it. And our choices can be influenced by the way data is presented. The dummy choice, for example. You'll be given some choices, but one is so ridiculous that you'll figure out all by yourself that this is the choice you ought to take. It gives us this illusion of free choice without the reality. And they can use addictive design. The like button. The like button really is addictive. People like getting likes. And they conform their behavior so they get more likes. And it exploits confirmation bias. Now, this was the recent scandal at Facebook and how they use confirmation bias to sort of tailor your Facebook page. So if you are addicted, say, if you are sort of inclined to conspiracy theories, they will show you more and more conspiracy theories, etc., things like that. And rage is a market strategy which increases involvement. So as people get angrier, they spend more and more time on Facebook, more and more time, that is, in rendering themselves as data and then being sold to advertisers. All of this together is called surveillance capitalism. Industrial capitalism exploited the earth to produce physical products. Surveillance capitalism exploits the psyche to produce prediction products. Behavior is being shaped in nefarious ways by very sophisticated means. And there are devastating effects on social capital. Clearly, there is a case for government regulation, but there are dangers with that. And here's one of them, the China syndrome. Now, in China, they have something called the social credit system. The government has teamed up with surveillance capitalism in China, and here are the results.
Imagine a world where everything you do, from meeting your friends to using a public toilet, is recorded. Based on your actions, ranging from what you buy to where you go, you are given a score similar to the way you rate an Uber drive. If the government believes what you do is socially beneficial, the score will increase, and if not, the score will decrease. If you critique the government, buy alcohol or play games, your score decreases, and when your score is low, you won't be allowed to travel, your children would be barred from applying to high school, you would be fired from your job, and the best part, you would be publicly shamed. This dystopian future is a reality of today's China. According to People's Daily, China's facial recognition system has become so advanced that it can scan the faces of 1.4 billion Chinese citizens in just a second. After the arrival of the internet in China in 1994, it became a very critical channel of communication for Chinese citizens. In a place where speech and access to information were heavily restricted, the internet became a medium where people could find uncensored news, speak their minds, and even organize protests. However, as time passed, the authorities found a way to block the free flow of information and use the internet for their benefit. Within a decade, they built an extensive infrastructure of surveillance combined with cutting-edge technologies. With the help of it, they tracked those who spoke against the government, and they were subsequently arrested or intimidated. Things worsened under Xi's era, when a ruling was made by Supreme People's Court in September 2013. According to it, a person could face a prison for 3 years for posting comments that spread rumors and are deemed to be defamatory by the authorities. Soon, the state media revealed that the government had hired more than 2 million individuals as microblog monitors to report on online postings to official censors. In 2016, a cybersecurity law was passed which further facilitated state control on the internet. Companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu were required to censor prohibited content to reduce the anonymity of people on the internet. They were instructed to ask people their real name with proof during registration. During the same period, the Chinese government was also working on Project Skynet. Skynet is a mass surveillance system that was created in 2005. However, the government revealed its existence in 2013, when it had already installed a network of 20 million cameras across the country. By 2019, this number increased from 20 million to 200 million. Authorities claim that this network allows them to track criminals within minutes and keep the public safe. But the question is, who will save the public from the government? In the name of fighting terrorism, members of predominantly Muslim ethnic groups located in the northwestern part of China are forced to give their biometric data like photos, fingerprints, DNA, blood and voice samples. Police then flag certain behaviours like growing a beard, leaving their house via a back door, or visiting the mosque, and those who do such things are red flagged by the system and interrogated by police, wrongly accused and put in prison camps. In some cases, authorities have installed surveillance cameras inside the homes of minority communities. The algorithms used in the surveillance network have become so good that they can detect the number of people in the frame, their gender, ethnicity, and age in real time. Moreover, they can identify the person by their style of walking when under 50 meters of distance from the camera. The United States and other countries also use some of the same techniques, but their use is limited to track terrorists or drug lords. But Chinese authorities want to use them to track everybody. Thanks to the high demand for surveillance cameras by the Chinese government, it has become a booming industry. Chinese government wants a better and efficient surveillance system, and companies want to secure big government contracts. So to get the contracts, companies are constantly improving their tech, ultimately benefiting the government efforts of making mass surveillance more efficient. But this is not limited to the camera on the streets. Your face is scanned in restaurants to give you meal recommendations, you can pay while shopping through face scan, and if you want to use toilet paper in public toilets, you guessed it, your face will be scanned first, and then the toilet paper will be dispensed through a machine. Surprisingly, according to The Times, the personal data of millions of people on the government servers was unprotected by even basic security measures. And they also found that private contractors and middlemen had wide access to personal data collected by the Chinese government. Coming back to cyber surveillance. Whatever you do online is being recorded. From your financial transactions to messages, everything is intercepted by Chinese authorities. Let's take the example of WeChat. WeChat started as a messaging app, then it transformed into Chinese Facebook, and then it added a ride-hailing service similar to Uber to its platform, and then it added banking services to its platform, and now you can use it as an ID. If you're living in China, you can file for divorce through this app. This will make your life very convenient, but at the same time, it also becomes very convenient for state security to track you. To combat message interceptions, they talk through emojis. A half-fallen rose means someone has been arrested. A dark moon means they are going to prison camps. A sun emoji means they are alive, and a flower means they have been released. Now combine cyber surveillance with Skynet, you get unimaginable power and control over 16% of the world's population. China calls it the social credit system. Whatever you do from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed is recorded. Based on your actions, your social credit score increases or decreases. If you praise the government publicly, donate blood, help the poor, engage in charity work, etc., your score increases. If your score is high, you'll get tax breaks, free gym, preference at hospitals, and if you do something which is considered to be wrongful by the government, the opposite happens. Due to the social credit system, people fail to look at the bigger picture as they are constantly busy improving their scores to avail the benefits which come with it. The ratings for every Chinese citizen are publicly available, and anyone can see them, completely eradicating their privacy and ruining their social life. If you raise your voice against the government, your score would decrease, and other people wouldn't know why your score is low. They might think it's low because you did something wrong, so they'd want to stay away from you. Soon, due to the fear of lower ratings and what others would think about them, similar to what happens on social media, citizens will refrain from any kind of independent expression, both on social media and real life, as this might lead to lower ratings, leading to a denial of basic human rights for them. The complete eradication of privacy helps the authorities to quash movements and protests against the government before they even start. According to many, China's mass surveillance is a grave new threat to freedom of expression and a violation of fundamental human rights.
Okay. Well, the question we want to ask is, could this happen here? Or better yet, is it happening already, but just in a different form? So, social credit or social conformity. Everything is tracked and rated. These ratings are public, which makes everybody a policeman. That is, your score can be lowered if your friends' scores are lowered. Okay, so if you're friends with a lot of people with low scores, your score will suffer. So in effect, everybody's part of the secret police. The stated goal is to increase cohesion and community. And community indeed does require some conformity. We have to conform our behaviors in some ways if we're all going to get along. But does forced conformity enhance or destroy community? And again I ask, are we doing the same thing, but just in a different way? Now, they mentioned in that film the persecution of the Uyghurs, and here's where the case really becomes important. The Uyghurs are an ethnic minority, 13 million people in northwest China. They're culturally distinct. Ethnically, they're Turkic-speaking people, and they're mostly Muslim. They have a completely different culture than the rest of China. Right? 1 million plus have been put into re-education camps. Now, the surveillance state that we just saw was first tested on the Uyghurs. Crimes, as the film noted, include growing a long beard, because that's popular among devout Muslim men, wearing veils, quoting the Quran, attending mosques, having foreign contacts, especially in Muslim countries, etc. It's a slow genocide, revealing the horrifying potential of the surveillance state. But you have to ask, what if it succeeds? Is this really good for China? They're cultivating the policeman within, as Foucault called it. And conformity, is that really the same as community? Can conformists innovate, for example? If you've spent your whole life, gearing yourself to expectations of those in authority, will you really be able to innovate? And if you can't innovate, will they be able to solve problems? Because that generally requires some kind of new thinking. So despite the appearance of absolute strength, is it fragile? And could it happen here? Is it happening here? By other means. Okay. What's to be done? Well, the short answer is, I don't know. But let's look at the power of technology. We started this by looking at cognitive technologies, and each initiated great and fundamental changes. Each had benefits, absolutely, and costs. So how can we maximize the benefits and minimize the costs? I have no answers, but I do have some questions and suggestions. The answers will depend on you. The benefits. Let's not forget about the benefits, because there are benefits. I mean, could we even run a complex society without computers and without the internet? I like the access to information. I even like being tracked in some ways. But the benefits must be universal. They cannot be confined to a certain group or class. And they cannot be used as a means of power and control. Now, the internet has resurfaced the question of censorship in new ways. We thought we had this question solved because the censorship usually applies to actions by governments. So, if a journal turns down one of my articles, I don't say I've been censored. I say I've been, refused publication. There's no censorship involved. But can a platform become so powerful as to be a threat? When somebody like Facebook censors you, is that kind of like the government censoring you? And it's raised the question of, should speech be regulated in the first place? Well, certainly, most people will say, I think porn. We certainly have a right to limit or eliminate porn, and certainly criminal activities. But how about things like disinformation? And who determines what is disinformation? We know disinformation campaigns are used by foreign governments to sow dissent and dissatisfaction within the United States, and I suspect that we do it in other places. Now, in every society, there's always a range of acceptable speech. Okay? I ask also this question: should users be anonymous? That is, should there be dummy accounts, or can there be multiple dummy accounts? So foreign governments have thousands and thousands of dummy accounts, so they spread disinformation very, very quickly. You see, it's an intelligence strategy that they use against their enemies, and meaning they use it against you and me. I want us to think about the question of social capital. Social media encourages tribalization. We dissolve into mutually incomprehensible groups, convinced that our rivals are evil. Not that they just disagree with us or they take another point of view, but that they are actually evil. This is the death of social capital. But culture is rooted in social capital. That's that mutual trust we have, that no matter how much we might argue, that in the end, people are basically good. We'll find a way to get along. We'll find a way to solve our problems. This social capital is necessary to solve any problem. With social capital, no problem is too big. We can face global warming. We can face a failure of the banks. We can face all sorts of difficulties, invasions, wars, whatever, if there is some kind of social cohesion. But without it, no problem can be solved. Well, can social capital be left to the benevolence of corporations? This brings us to the question of regulation. Now, Facebook has recently been running a series of ads that say, "Oh, please regulate us." Pardon me, but I am suspicious. And I believe that they can pull off regulatory capture. That is, they can simply write what they're doing into the regulations, and then they'll be protected from any possible lawsuit. We were just following the law. So you can count me as among the very, very skeptical. I believe, just as a starting place, algorithms and terms of service, those documents that you click through, and whenever you load an app or something like that, you have to agree to the terms of service. None of us ever read them. And if we did, someone's estimated that if you read all the terms of service, it would take you 72 man days a year. The use of information should be regulated. And we can ask, do we need a national firewall? Well, what's a firewall? A firewall prevents information from coming in, or regulates information that comes into the nation. China uses what's called the Great China Wall of Fire to keep out almost all foreign information. That may be going too far, but at the same time, maybe there is some benefit in having a national firewall. Antitrust. We should break up the large corporations. Break up Google, break up Meta. Now, some thinkers, Cory Doctorow among them, think that just breaking up these corporations will solve the problem. I'm not so sanguine about that point, but nevertheless, I think we could reduce their power by invoking the antitrust laws. Now, how to regulate them, I won't go into that here, but I refer you back to the lecture on Catholic social teaching and political order to the principles of regulation, and you can think about which of those principles apply in this situation. And I'm also putting in here just a little link which you can copy, or I'll maybe put it on the discussion board, to a group I think that has done some serious work on ways to regulate social media. I think they're worth, if you're interested in that question, I think it's worth looking at. But finally, we have to think about it from this standpoint: social media and you and me. Should we just opt out of social media? Well, that's one strategy. I don't think it's the best strategy. It sort of relates to opting out of turning off the TV during all advertising. It really doesn't work. But remember, when you are on social media, that this is a matter of self-presentation. Who do you want to present yourself as? So be an apostle of reason and of love. Don't participate in hate and anger. Try to maintain a sense of humor, especially when people start calling you bad names. Don't let them bring you down to their level, okay? And for goodness sake, please check sources, both your own and others. When you post something that sounds way out there, check the source. When you read something that sounds bizarre, ask that person for their sources. Okay? I would recommend that you regulate yourself. Limit the amount of time you spend on social media. And I recommend a Lenten fast. So every Lent, I get off social media. Okay? 40 days without social media, I think, is a good idea. It gives you kind of a chance to recharge and maybe to get some actual work done. Well, let me suggest that your generation will have to wrestle with this problem. All right. Okay. So, whoop, I have no idea what happened there. Let's think about the questions that confront us. Is China our future? Will behavioral technology just get more and more sophisticated? And as it does, will tyrants or corporations be able to resist the temptation to use them to increase their control, to increase their sales? Are we all just Uyghurs? Or Uyghurs in waiting? These are questions that I think you really ought to think about. And so I really do look forward to our discussion in class, in our study groups, and on the discussion board. All right. With that, then, I will see you in the study groups and online. Right. Have a good weekend.